Rebbe said Tachnan in 32 days. For those of you who missed confession and supplication, so today was a big day for you, right? We got the daven again. After he got another mishige. Okay, me and my machines. Sorry, people. Today is the birthday of the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe. His name was Shmuel, Harav Shmuel. The second day of the month of Iyar. He was born in 1834. Okay, and it was decided by the committee, that means the school, that I should talk to all of you and that we should discuss the Rebbe Maharash. So that's what we're going to do. I'm talking to all you about the Rebbe Maharash. I'm supposed to have 2 periods, but I showed up, my traditional half an hour late. I'm sorry. What difference does it make, right? What's it going to help? So that's what we're going to do. So about the Rebbe Maharash. I want to start the story in a funny place. I don't want to start the story when he was born. I'll go back to that. I want to start the story in the middle. I want to start the story in the middle because I want to tell you the story, not just as a story. I love telling stories, by the way, and no one gets hurt from stories. Philosophy can hurt people. Law can certainly hurt people. Stories are harmless. But I want to start this conversation at a point that will give you a sense not just of the life and of this great man, but the challenges of his life, the struggles of his life, or perhaps even his definition as a Rebbe, as a leader, as a Gadol B'Yisrael. His father was the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, whose name was Rebbe Menachem Mendel. The Rebbe and him have the same name. The Rebbe is Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's wife, and his wife also the same name, Chaya Mushka. He was a Rebbe for a long time, for close to 4 decades. He was an incredibly successful Rebbe, very successful Rebbe. They say that he had 1 million Chassidim. That's a bit of a tricky statement because 1 million Chassidim doesn't mean that he had 1 million people visiting Lubavitch. Because in those days, especially in Chabad, you could have been a Chassid of a Rebbe and never gotten to meet him. You just corresponded with him, you sent messages, you followed his traditions. But the Tzemach Tzedek was an incredibly successful Rebbe. He presided over the Jewish people during, I don't think there is such a thing as an easy period in Jewish history, but a rather difficult period. He was the Rebbe of the Cantonists, if you know that story. He took the position as the decree of the Cantonists was being established, and it pretty much ended when he passed away. So it was his tenure was marked by a number of very, very critical events happening to the Jewish people in Russia, and one of them was the Cantonists. But at the same time, during his leadership, the condition of the Jewish people in Russia was stable. The Jewish people which was probably the largest Jewish community in place in the world at that time. It probably numbered 3 million people. Was probably the most stable. It was quite stable. Jews were from. People were living in the same places as their parents, building homes, getting married, raising children, and so on. He passed away in 1866. The Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Lubavitcher in 1866. In the last months of his life, so I just want to say before I continue, when he passed away, Chabad was splintered. Chabad was split into 4 groups. From those 4, the only thing that's left is Lubavitch. But at that time, if you go back 150 years, Lubavitch was actually the smallest Chabad. The largest Chabad was a movement which is now obsolete. It doesn't exist anymore, called Kapust. It was a very big Rebbe with many, many thousands of Hasidim. There was another Rebbe in Liadi, there was another Rebbe in Yezhin. These are cities in some place in Russia or in the Ukraine. And then Lubavitch. The Rebbe Maharash, the youngest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children, whose birthday we're celebrating today, was the Rebbe in Lubavitch. When he started out as a Rebbe, he had very few Hasidim. Almost everybody left. And over the course of his, whatever it was, 17 or 18 years as a Rebbe, he built a relatively small community of Hasidim. But and the split of Lubavitch, I think, was very costly. It was costly to Lubavitch. Anytime a movement splits, both halves are less than they would be if they were a whole. But I also think that the split in Lubavitch probably had an adverse effect on the Jewish people living in Russia altogether because of the pressures that were coming from around. So here's the story that I want to tell you. I believe this story is a critical story in understanding the history of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia. In other words, I think this story is not just a Shena Maises, it's a nice story, but it's a story that explains the evolution of Jewish life before 1865, 1866, and after 1860, even to this day. The story is as follows. The third Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, was in his late 70s. He was 77 years old, 76 years old, 77 years old. And he would summon his young son, the Rebbe Maharash, who was the youngest of his children. He had 9 children, 2 girls and 7 boys. The Rebbe Maharash was by far the youngest. His oldest children were in their 60s. The Rebbe Maharash was 31, 32 years old. He was much younger than his brothers. He had a whole army of nephews and nieces when he was born. He was a true Ben Skunim. And his father would call him, and he'd walk into his father's room, and his father would open a medrash, the Medrash Rabbah, and he would read. It's the beginning of the book of Exodus, beginning of Sefer Shmois, where it says, Joseph died, his brothers died, and the whole generation died. This is the beginning of the story of the enslavement of the Jewish people in Egypt. Yosef HaTzadik was the Beis Iyar, he was the vice king. He was very powerful in Egypt, but he dies, and his brothers die. The whole generation dies out. And then, of course, the Pharaoh makes all kind of decrees. We know the story of the exile and the exodus in Egypt. So the passage is, the pasuk is, Yosef died, his brothers died, the whole generation died. So this is a quote from the Chumash, from the scripture, from the Tanakh, from the Chumash. So the Tzemach Tzedek would read from the Medrash those words, and then he would read the commentary. Afal pisha mesu elu, which means in English, even though these tzaddikim, these righteous men died, their God didn't die. Although they passed away, their God didn't die. This happened a bunch of times during the course of 6 months, from the beginning of the calendar year of 5626, Tafresh Chavav, which would be 1865, 1866, until the Tzemach Tzedek passing. He passed away the day before Pesach. How many times did it happen? If it happened 3 times, it's also a lot. It may have happened 5. It happened occasionally. Tzemach Tzedek would call his young son, he would open the Medrash and read, and that was it. Close it. The pasuk says the old tzaddikim all died, but God didn't die. The Tzemach Tzedek would read this Medrash to his son, and the Rebbe Maharash would stand and smile. Then he would walk out of the room and walk into another room, and he would sob uncontrollably. Because the Rebbe Maharash understood exactly what it was that his father was telling him. I'm going to speak about Hasidus, but I don't think it's limited to Hasidus. I think it really is, it's bigger than Hasidus, but I'm going to talk about Hasidus. Hasidus dominated Eastern Europe, not Western Europe, Eastern Europe. And there were far more Jews in Eastern Europe than, I'm talking about Ashkenazic Jews, not Sephardic Jews. There were far more Jews in Eastern Europe than Western Europe. And all of Western Europe probably had, a few 100,000 Jews. In Eastern Europe, you may have had 7, 8, 9 million Jews. The numbers were much greater. The Western Europeans had already kicked us out hundreds of years before. Eastern European Jews were many, many Jews. Hasidus was started officially in 1734, 150 years before this. And or 125 years with, and Hasidus was a fever. Hasidus was incredibly infectious. It was very successful, very successful. I'm not sure it's an exaggeration to say that half the Jews in Eastern Europe were Hasidim, 50%. Maybe it's less, but it's not much less. It's not 5%. Hasidus was an incredibly effective and successful way of life. And Hasidim were very real, very passionate, very frum, very positive, very connected to their Rebbes. And Hasidus flourished. It really flourished. The candle the Baal Shem Tov lit had become many torches, and it was distributed all over Eastern Europe. There were different Hasidic groups, there were different Hasidic forms, there were different Hasidic leaders. Many of these people were very holy. Some of these tzaddikim were incredibly holy people, which means deeply connected to God, very humble, very kind, and they gave their flock more than anything else, themselves. And in this relationship, the people who were around them were affected by their fire. Tzemach Tzedek passed away in 1866. Between 1864 and 1866 or 7, an entire generation of tzaddikim died, a whole generation. It wasn't just Lubavitch. All of the great Hasidic masters who presided over the Jewish people in the middle part of the 19th century died in a very short time. Some of the names are very famous, of Mendel of Kotsk, Reb Shalom of Belz, Reb Yitzchak Meir of Gur. Wherever you looked, there were massive Hasidic movements, and in a matter of 2 or 3 years, it's like a whole generation died. Mamish, a whole generation passed away. It wasn't just one person. It's almost like the Eibishter was turning a page. And I hate to say this, if you'll study the years 1991 to 1995, which is just 25 years ago, you'll see exactly the same thing. It wasn't one person, a whole generation of leaders in a very short time. If you'll study it, you'll see that it's much more than coincidental. The effect of this, plus the pressures from the outside, are that when the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, when the third Lubavitcher passed away, the fourth Lubavitcher took his place, besides for the problems that he had, the Lubavitch was split into many branches. He didn't have the infrastructure, he didn't have the support, he didn't have the people, he didn't have the power that this yields. The situation of Jews in Eastern Europe began to change in a negative direction. And what the Tzemach Tzedek was saying to his son, to the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe, the tzaddikim are going away. And explain it any way you wish, with the demise, with the passing of this entire generation of tzaddikim. Like the famous Mameh Chazal, Al mi yesh lanu lehishaim, who can we lean on? Only God. There's nobody else. And if you'll study what happened to the Jewish people in Eastern Europe between then, 1865, slowly but surely you see a corrosion of Jewish people as a religious entity. Yiddishkeit began to collapse and crumble. And it gets worse and worse over time. A lot of people will tell you that in Eastern Europe, Russia especially, and also in Galicia, Poland, but Galicia, Poland was much more acutely affected by the First World War. You start to see a collapse of Yiddishkeit, Yiddish living. I'm just going to give you a simple number. It's probably even true about 1890, but it's certainly true about 1865. In 1865, the percent of the Jewish people in the world who were Orthodox, who were Frum, was probably 95%, 90% for sure. And I'm including Reform, including Western European Jews. In a relatively short time, within 50 years, certainly by the time World War I comes, and certainly by the time World War II comes, those numbers are reversed. The percentage of Jewish people that are Frum in the world today, it's less than 10%. Today, in 2021, it's less than 10%. If you go back to the post-Holocaust years, to 1950, it probably was 5%. Mamish. And you have to step back and watch this. You have to step back and see this. And all of this is in this one medrash. Everything that I'm describing to you, I don't mean to be dramatic, but I don't want to just tell a story. I want to give you an insight into what leadership is, what a Rebbe does. Rebbes are given challenges. The challenges of a Rebbe is the Jewish people and the reality of the world. The Rebbe Maharash was a Rebbe for a relatively short time. He was a Rebbe over a relatively small community, but his years were very, very difficult years for the Jewish people in many ways, but especially in the beginning of the end of the golden age of Eastern European Jewry. And he was keenly aware of what was going on. And he responded to it in the way he thought he should have responded. I have certain specifics that I think that Rebbe Maharash did. And this is a pattern that goes from a Rebbe to a Rebbe. The Rebbe Maharash was the fourth Lubavitcher Rebbe. His son was the Rebbe Rashavi, was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. Then, of course, the previous Rebbe. And we go full circle. I'll explain to you what I mean full circle in a moment. But I just want to enlighten you to this thing that, and I guess I'll explain it to you a little bit. There were a lot of pressures brought to bear on Jews in Russia. The Cantonese was an incredible punch in the stomach. It was a very difficult thing to deal with. Thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews were taken out of their homes as children, and they became, career soldiers for their whole life. And they built communities of Cantonists. They were incredibly ignorant, and it was very difficult to teach them. That's just one of a variety of different challenges. One of the things that was going on is there was a lot of pressure that came from the Haskalah, from the reform that had swept through Western Europe, and they wanted to change Eastern European Jewry, and they pushed and they pushed and they pushed. They used the government to force Orthodox Jews from Jews, Shtetl Yidden, to change the model of pedagogy, how they were raising their children, and they eventually succeeded. They pushed and they pushed back. Slowly but surely, the concept that we would call today a secular Jew to me is an oxymoron. The concept of a secular Jew began to crystallize. It began to take on a form. And if I needed to explain it to myself, the way I would explain it to myself is to say, there were a lot of Jews, maybe millions of them, who were frum, religious, Orthodox, frum, but they weren't sure why. And maybe they wished they weren't. That began to change in 1865. Or as the old Yiddish expression is, you're better outside looking in than being inside looking out. There was more and more of people being on the inside looking out. Meaning to say, if you would visit Russia in 1880, you would find huge communities of millions of Orthodox Jews, all told. But a lot of them, even if they were Chassidim, they didn't have the passion, they didn't have the meaning, they didn't have the joy, they didn't have the sense of purpose that existed just one generation before. And when you practice a way of life and you don't really believe it, and you believe in it less and less over time, it's like a body being eaten out from the inside. Eventually there's nothing left to hold it up and it just collapses. And that's what happened to the Jewish people of Europe over the last 150 years. And the Chabad Rabbeim had two distinct responses to this. And I'm sharing this with you. This is what I'm doing. Okay, I'll get to the stories later. I promise I'll tell you some stories. Hope I don't put you to sleep. But the Chabad Rabbeim had two different reactions. And it's very interesting to observe. And again, I don't want to make it sound like the only people who worried about Jews were the Chabad Rabbeim. It's not true. There were other Gedolei Yisrael. But the Chabad Rabbeim certainly held a leadership role. I'm talking about Russia now in this. And it's interesting to see how they responded. Again, I'm going to divide this up into two periods because I want you to see what's evolved from then until now. Oh, but I want to tell you a story. As an introduction. This same Rebbe Maharash, whose birthday is today, he was born in 1834, right? And now is 2021, right? I don't know how old he is. He's over 150 years old, right? At this point, or close to 150 years old. I guess in 2024, right? Am I correct? Huh? Did not account? 1834, 1934, 1984. No, he's way over 150 years old, right? He's 180 years old, the Rebbe Maharash. Near the end of his life, the early 1880s, there were huge pogroms in Russia. And pogroms in Russia were never an accident. They were never spontaneous. They were always organized by the Tsar, by the central government. And thousands of Jews would be murdered, and the amount of loss of property was terrible. And the Jews would just do what they always did. They rebuilt and started over. And then a generation again, boom. This was the beginning of the immigration of Jewish people from Russia to the United States after the Civil War, 1880, maybe even a little bit before. But in the early 1800s, there were terrible, terrible pogroms. And the Jews of Russia had various reactions. One of the reactions was a movement which is called Bilu. Beis Yud Lamed Vav. Bilu is the first name of what we call today modern Zionism. Bilu was before Herzl. Bilu was an abbreviation. Beis Yaakov L'chu V'nelcha, House of Jacob, come let us go. This was a movement of Jews from Russia who emigrated to Israel in 1881 and 1882 and those years. It was the first, what's called, they call it today in the language of modern Israel, Aliyah Rishon, the first Aliyah. Then later on, there were other Jews who came to Israel. The first Aliyah had a lot of from Jews. The second one was much more secular Jews. But there was a big movement of Jews to leave Russia. And the Rebbe Maharash, who was one of the leaders of the Jewish people in Russia, was involved in the thick of this time period. And this question of immigrating to Zion, to Israel, was something which was on his mind. So the famous quote, which is attributed to the Rebbe Maharash, is that the Rebbe Maharash said that the passage from Tehillim, it's from Psalms, Beis Yaakov L'chu V'nelcha, House of Jacob, come let us go. There's two more words. We say it every day in davening. We said it this morning. B'oir Hashem, in the light of God. Beis Yaakov L'chu V'nelcha, House of Jacob, come let us go. B'oir Hashem, the Rebbe Maharash said, if this movement had added the two words, the light of God, he would have joined and moved to Israel. I'm not so sure it's that simple, honestly. But if the Rebbe Maharash had picked himself and moved to Israel, the face of the Jewish world then would have been very different because he would have brought thousands of Hasidim with him. I don't know how many, but enough. And how the history of the next 150 years, how the Holocaust would have played out, could have been quite different. It's hard to know any of this. But the bottom line is, and this is the point that I want to make, is that Rebbe Maharash did not leave. He stayed in Russia. He pushed back against the pogroms. He challenged the Russian government on the highest level of government. And I'm going to tell you the story because it's a remarkable story. It's a remarkable story. If you know anything about Chabad Rebbes, and again, I'm not expecting you to, but if you know anything about Chabad Rebbes, you know that the Chabad Rebbes, there were 7 of them, had very different personalities. Some of the Chabad Rebbes, for lack of words, didn't really live in this world. They were incredibly holy and they were removed. They were not involved in the nitty-gritty of the society which they lived. The Rabbeim always were involved. But some of the Chabad Rabbeim wouldn't speak Russian. They would speak only Yiddish, and they would give the impression, they wanted people to think of them as Batlonim, they don't know what's going on. And it was a cover. It was actually a good way of keeping the governmental pressures which the Rabbeim had at bay. Some of the Rabbeim tried to give the impression that they're holy people, they're not in this world. You know, there's a famous report that was made by the early Haskalah that came into Russia. He said that Tzemach Tzedek is a very powerful man, but he doesn't have a clue what's going on. Just be nice to him and you can run circles around him. And the Tzemach Tzedek was run circles around the people who thought they were running circles around him at the very time. But some of the Chabad Rabbeim gave the impression of being incredibly worldly, sophisticated, educated, knowledgeable, and in the thick of it. I guess there was no Rebbe like our Rebbe in terms of that, but the Rebbe Maharash was the same thing. The Rebbe Maharash spoke many languages. He practiced medicine. he was a self-trained medical doctor. He used to heal himself. He was incredibly worldly. He was a holy, holy man. He was a very worldly person. He used to read the newspapers. He knew what was going on. He was in touch with many, many business people all over Europe. And his style of Rebbeship was cosmopolitan. He was the Maharash. From all the Chabad Rabbeim, when you hear about him, he was afraid of no one and nothing. He was the most bold of the Chabad Rabbeim, maybe even more than this Rebbe. He was so, the Chatchila Rebbe is how he lived. He was afraid of nobody. His personality was so interesting. He was a very physically ill man. He was always sick. He always had a smile on his face. He was always smiling. And he would look in your direction and you would start to tremble from fear. And you couldn't understand what you were afraid of. He had such power. His charisma was so powerful. His personality would just look at you, Jew or non-Jew. You would start to tremble. And you had no idea what you're afraid of. He's smiling at you. Incredibly powerful man. So in the early 1880s, there were pogroms. Beklal, when there were pogroms in Russia, the reason was because the Tsar wasn't doing well. You don't need me to tell you that Eastern Europeans, begematria, ineptitude. The Russian Tsars who ruled Russia for a very, very long time, for hundreds of years, were not very good rulers. They ruled from the top. It was an autocracy. There was the noble elite, and then there was the all the serfs and the indentured. 97% of the population lived in poverty, and 3% lived in the lap of luxury, and there was always this discontent. People were not happy. So the czars, the kings, and their stooges would suppress this unrest, if need be, with violence. And if the unrest became too severe, in Russia, the word revolution is like in America, the words good morning. There was always talk of revolution, always. Sometimes they tried, sometimes they didn't try. So when the Tsar and his council and his officers felt that the pressure on them was too great, they would distract the Russian peasants by orchestrating anti-Semitism. It was a political tool. You've heard of the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Have you read this book? Anybody have read the Protocols? The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written by the Russian government at this time in the 1880s. And it's killed so many Jews. It's been responsible for so much hate. So for pogroms in Russia, it was a politique. It was a political technique. It was a way of keeping the country in check. So when there were pogroms, the government looked away because the government orchestrated it. So who are you going to have to protect you? So whenever there were pogroms, the Jews just licked their wounds. The Rebbe Maharash was a cool operator. He got on a train. He traveled to Petersburg, which was the capital then. And he met with the Minister of State, a very important person in the government. And he said, listen, the pogroms have to... He asked to meet the Minister of State. And the Minister of State told him that he's busy. He has to wait a while. He's a Newman, busy. The story before the story is this. He came to Moscow first, and he made a meeting of all the Jewish leadership in Russia. This is what, 1882. The leadership of Russia, of Jews in Russia, were by then mostly not from people, powerful businessmen, lawyers, people of great influence, great wealth. Most of them were not from already then. And the Rebbe Maharash called them to a meeting and said, listen, we have to stop these pogroms. We've got to do something about it. There's a lot of details to the story. Some of them are not so pleasant. The bottom line is he started giving orders. You do this, and you do this, and you do this. So one of them said to the Rebbe Maharash, Lubavitcher Rebbe, with all due respect, we're not your Hasidim, we're not your puppies. You don't just tell us what to do. With us, you consult. We'll talk it over, we'll make a decision together, and we'll do it together. You're not in charge. So the Rebbe Maharash told him what it says in the Megillah, that when Esther hesitated to go to Achashverosh, Mordechai said to Esther, I want you to know the Jews are going to survive. You have an opportunity to help, and if you don't help, you'll disappear and the Jews will survive without you. And the Rebbe Maharash said, if you don't want to do it my way, that's fine. And he said, I'll use my own Chassidim. He got up and he walked out and he used his own Chassidim. The Rebbe Maharash had a couple of Chassidim also very well to do. They were from Jews. And he pulled off essentially this coup. He came to Petersburg and he asked to meet the Minister of Interior, the Minister of State. He probably had a different name, and he told him he's busy. So the Rebbe Maharash traveled to Paris. The Rebbe Maharash traveled to Berlin. He probably traveled to Vienna. And he met reporters. And within 48 hours, the largest newspapers in Western Europe had condemning articles claiming that the Russian government is killing Jews. And there was talk of sanctions. Do you understand what that means? He blackmailed Russia. He got back on a train and went straight back to Petersburg. When he showed up in Petersburg, everybody important was waiting to see him. All of a sudden, there was the cloud. The calendars were all clear. The Minister of State wanted to tear him limb from limb. And he says, that's what you just did. This is treason. You're undermining the government. He says, I know exactly what I did. He says, you could lose your life. He says, I'm not thinking about me. I'm just going to sit and watch Jewish blood spill, and you're telling me, come back in a week, I have no time? And the pogrom stopped. The pogrom stopped. And within weeks or months, he was gone. He passed away. In our Rebbe's journal, the previous Rebbe told the Rebbe that the Rebbe Maharash said, the pogroms are going to stop and I'm going to lose my life. He gave his life spiritually. The pogrom stopped. And what I want to teach you from this is the position of the Rebbe Maharash was, we stay in Russia as long as we absolutely can. Now, one more thing. for lack of words, the position of the Chabad Rebbeim, the Rebbe Maharash, his son, the Rebbe Rashab, and even his son, the previous Rebbe, the attitude that they took for a very, very long time in dealing with the collapse of the Jewish community in Russia, because of all the pressures and all of the tzaddis and all of the influences and all of the enlightenments, what they call the age of the isms, was a holding pattern. Try to save what you can. There was a defensive mode. In other words, some Jews are still from, let's keep them from. The attitude was, if you left Yiddishkeit, you were outside. If you were inside Yiddishkeit, we wanted to keep you. And this was the position they took for a long time, for 50 years probably, or more. It's a very traditional Orthodox Jewish approach. You know, you sit in your wall, you put walls around yourself, and you hope nobody sneaks out. No one leaks out, but it just doesn't work. But really until America, until the previous Rebbe came to America, the attitude of the Chabad Rabbeim was, let's preserve what's still from. Let's hold on to, so to speak, what's left. She'eres ha'pleita. So if you want to think in terms of numbers, if in 1865, 90 or 95% of the Jews in the world were from, by 1940, when the Rebbe came to America, those numbers were in reverse. But for all that time, the attitude, even of the Chabad Rebbes, and certainly the other great leaders, was let's keep what we can. It was a defensive approach. And then the Rebbe came to America. And when the Rebbe, and by the way, when you take that approach, there's a very us and them attitude. You understand? There's, forgive me for saying it, there's good Jews and bad Jews. You're inside or you're outside. And there was an attitude of dogma. We have to keep people from, and we have to fight with the enemy, the Jew who's not from. And you could explain it, because the Jew who was not from then knew what frumkeit was, but I don't want to even go into that. The Rebbe came to America and he just changed his entire philosophy. He changed his entire philosophy, the previous Rebbe. And he became Mr. Inclusive. You know, Chabad Rabbeim, who just going back a few generations ago represented dogma. They represented the idea of keeping the tradition and not letting anybody contaminate it, and holding on to your kernel, holding on to your seat, holding on to your vestige, holding on to your little beacon of light, came to this country and did a 180-degree reversal. The attitude became, there's no such thing as a bad Jew. We have to be makad of everybody. We have to bring people to tshuva. In 1956, our Rebbe spoke a talk, which I think it's a watershed talk. I think it's a historic talk. It doesn't get enough attention. But this is what he said. The Rebbe was sitting at a Fabrengen. There's a tape of it. It's a weekday sikha, so you can actually hear the Rebbe's own words. And he gave a presentation about tactics of war, tactics of military. It's very interesting to listen to the Rebbe talk about war. The Rebbe studied everything and he understood everything, and the Rebbe was quite schooled. He was self-taught in the tactics of war. And he said there's two basic approaches to war tactics. Again, I don't know that much, but from what I've read, war is not complicated. War, there's not 101 different ways to fight a war. There's a few ways to fight a war. It's basically a concentration of people and kill more than you're killed. That's it's not. War is black and white. It's not. There's no nuance in war. But there's two basic tactics of war. There is a defensive tactic of war, and there's an offensive tactic of war. And if you've studied the last 150 years, right, what was the model of the defensive tactic of war? It starts with the Civil War. If you're familiar with the Civil War, during the Civil War, the concept of trench warfare was created. Trench warfare means you're far better as a soldier standing in your position and defending your position and let the other guy attack you. And the culmination of that was World War I, when tens of millions of soldiers died because they left a defensive position and went on offense. It happened over and over, both from the eastern side, both on the European side and on the German side, on the eastern front and on the western front. So trench warfare was defense. It was a good tactic for a while. And it said, you're better off staying in your fixed position. When the enemy attacks you, you fight back. Then there's another tactic war, which is offensive war. And I'm sorry for bringing this up. The Nazis perfected that. The Nazis fought a battle based on the principle of Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg is such a risky approach to war. If you understand Blitzkrieg, because you have flanks that are exposed. Blitzkrieg only works if it's a blitz. A blitz means lightning speed, but it was incredibly effective. So you have two approaches. You can either take a position, what's called Milchemes Hagana, defensive war, where you sit in your fixed position and let the enemy attack you and you defend yourself. And then the other is Milchemes Tnufa, which is aggressive war. So the Rebbe actually presented this at a Fabrengen, these two tactics of war, and then he said, what are the advantages and disadvantages of each? And he argued that offensive warfare, being the aggressor, has a number of advantages. Number one, you get to choose the time and place of the battle. One of the most important things in a battlefield, in the olden days more than now, is the terrain. You want to be at the high ground. If you are the aggressor, if you start the fight, you get to choose where and when. Number two, this is very critical, if you are the aggressor, if you start the fight, the collateral damage, the people who get hurt by mistake and the property that's damaged coincidentally happens by the enemy. And then the Rebbe said this 60 years ago, 65 years ago. He says over the last 100 years, he didn't specify it that much. He says the position of Frum Jews has always been defense. We sit in our Winkele, we sit in our corner, and we try to keep what we have, and we wait to be attacked. Then we call emergency meetings, and we respond to it. And the Rebbe says we don't really plan, we don't really prepare, we just do our thing, and then when there's an attack against our faith and our tradition and our community, we push back. And he says we continue to lose. He said we continue to lose. The Rebbe used the expression, we continue to lose, and the Rebbe says it's time to go on offense. This is a change of heart in the leadership of the Chabad Rabbeim, that for many, many years, their attitude was very traditional, protect, hold on to what's left. And then in America, the Rebbeim took an entirely different position. And this is the Lubavitch that we grew up with and know. It's the only Lubavitch we know. Incredibly open. And in every war, there's casualties. Until Mashiach comes, it's a war between good and evil, between Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Hara. But the attitude has been changed. I think that Baal Shem Tov was born for this. I believe that Hasidus was born for this. Certainly beginning with 1865, with the Rebbe Maharash. You can read this, you don't have to trust me. If you look in experts on Hasidism who are not from, they will point to 1865 and say that's the beginning of the end of the golden age of Hasidus. I saw it in their writings. It's true. What's happened in the last 150 years? And what's the point of it all? I sat with my Bacham last night in the yeshiva, and with boys in the yeshiva, and a Fabrengen you have all night long. And I said to them, there's a one-word insight into what's been going on for the last 150 years. In the two stages that I described, as it reflects the Lubavitcher leaders, Lubavitcher Rebbes. And that one word is the word tshuva. Tshuva. I don't think you'll find ever a period in Jewish history where so many Jews who are not Jewish are so proud to be defined as Jews. If you were not Orthodox, you weren't a Jew. No? Being Jewish and being frum was synonymous. Today, so many Yidden in this world they're very Jewish, they're very proud to be Jewish, but they don't practice for whatever reason. So to me, a secular Jew is an oxymoron because the word Jew is deeply religious. The word is deeply religious. It's a deeply religious word. And secular Jews' loyalty to that word is a very deeply religious loyalty, even if they don't practice. The Gemara predicted that before Mashiach comes, there's going to be an era of tshuva. The Rambam writes in his law of tshuva that before Mashiach comes, there's going to be a period of tshuva. We're living this. In my mindset, in my way of thinking, the Rebbe Maharash's tenure, and again, I want you to remember, it wasn't just one man. An entire generation of Gedolei Yisrael passed away within 24 to 36 months. An entire generation of great and holy rabbis, including as well as great brilliant scholars on the Misnagdim side and Ashkenazim side, died like this. And there was a new generation of Jews, new generation of leaders, a new generation of challenges. And for a very, very long time, it was bad and getting worse. It was bad and getting worse. Now, it's bad and getting better. I was at a wedding a couple of months ago, and I'm uptight and closed-minded and rigid and all the things you don't think I am because of the way I talk. But trust me, I'm uptight and rigid and closed-minded. And let's just say it wasn't a Hasidic wedding, okay? It wasn't a Hasidic wedding. And I don't like the music, and I don't like the dancing, and I don't like the mixing of men and women. All these things bug me. And I have other people who know that I'm that kind of guy. So someone that I'm very, very close to, who I respect enormously, goes over to me. And the truth of the matter is, the wedding was surprisingly tame. It was not what I expected it to be, much worse. And he goes over to me and says, I'm going to tell you something. He says, 30 years ago, I was at such a wedding. And the boys and the girls looked exactly the same as they look today. He says, but then they were looking out. It was right after Gimel Tammuz. The kids had all grown up under the Rebbe's legs, and they were rebelling. He says, these kids are looking in. That's what he told me. Now, I don't know if it's true or false, but there's certainly some truth to it. The Jewish people, as far as Hashem is concerned, Mashiach's coming, right? We're holding the threshold, the process of tshuva. And this process of tshuva, if you, like I said, if you study the history, you see the curve, you see what's been going on. And leaders, each leader in his generation, each leader using his technique, his tactics, his philosophy, contributes to try and remedy whatever challenges face the Jewish people. And if I needed to say what I think that Rebbe Maharash brought to the table, this is just me speaking now, I'm making this up, okay? I have no authority to say it, but you can stop me if you want. But I'm going to say it is, the Rebbe Maharash's philosophy and his son, the Rebbe Rashab's philosophy was, you don't move unless you're forced. You're living in Russia, you stay in Russia. Life in Russia was very hard. The idea that Jews, you see challenge, you run, that's not the way Jewish leaders led. At some point, you have to leave. And that point was, the beginning of it was World War I, the end of it was World War II. I'm sure you've considered the following fact. 95% of the Jews alive today, wherever they live, and most of the Jews live either in Israel or the United States of America, 95% of the Jews in the world today are not living in the same place where their ancestors lived 100 years ago. Think about it. Almost each one of us is a transplant. My roots are Czechoslovakian, are Galicia, Hungary, are Russian. Almost everybody in this room can say, I come from Morocco, I come from Tunisia, I come from Algeria, I come from Syria, I come from Libya, I come from Egypt, I come from Afghanistan, I come from Iraq, I come from Iran, I come from Turkey. Almost all the Jews in the world have moved to new places. When you move to a new place, you got to start over. Starting over is very painful. And the Rebbe Maharash said, we're staying in Russia as long as we can. When you can't stay in Russia, you leave Russia. When you can't hold on to the old, you create the new. But I wanted to share this. This is what I wanted to say in my opening sikha, my opening talk about the Rebbe Maharash. So I shared an insight with you. If anybody wants to ask any questions or make any comment or throw spitballs, now's the time to do all of those things. If there's nothing on your mind, we're going to break for 5 minutes. We'll see how long 5 minutes lasts. And then I'll tell you some stories about the Rebbe Maharash. Okay, I'll make the conversation a little bit lighter. Yeah. You can ask questions and make comments or throw spitballs. I gave you permission to do one of 3 things. Okay, we're going to break. Yes, I get it. Okay, I'm turning you off also, right?
Rabbi?
Yes, ma'am.
Programs weren't a reason enough.